Welcome back to Moments That Matter. Today, as we begin our second season, we sit down and talk with writer, speaker, and teacher Dr. Corey Latta. We're specifically discussing his newest book, C.S. Lewis and the Art of Writing, by Wipf and Stock. I think you'll really be blessed by Corey and what he has to share with us today, and will definitely want to get his book. Thanks for tuning in.
Welcome to Moments That Matter. As my co-host Scott Williams might say, and we're back after a summer-long hiatus during which we conducted only one interview. So we may be a little rusty, but we're looking forward to bringing you some exceptional interviews to feast your ears on. We are joined today by Corey Latta, author of the book C.S. Lewis and the Art of Writing, published by Wipf and Stock Publishers. Corey's academic background ranges the gamut from biblical studies and theology to English, including a PhD in 20th-century literature from the University of Southern Mississippi. He is the author of numerous articles, poems, and books, including the one that we'll be talking about today. Corey, thank you so much for being with us on Moments That Matter.
Yeah, good to be here.
As I scan through your academic degrees, I see that you began with biblical studies and theology, but migrated toward English in your second master's and then your doctorate. Can I ask what brought that about?
Yeah, in keeping with the theme, here's a moment that mattered. I was in seminary, and to be honest, my head was full, but my heart was empty. And I was going through a bit of a spiritual depression, honestly. Loved the intellectual side of things, but I had read all the Greek and New Testament world, and backgrounds and Pauline theology I could handle. So I was at a yard sale, and I just wanted to read something to sort of escape. And I was always a Van Gogh fan. I picked up a book called Lust for Life by a writer named Irving Stone. Irving Stone wrote these series of kind of historical fictions or fictionalized histories. Mostly accurate, but some embellishment here and there. He's done one on John Adams and Michelangelo and Van Gogh and I think Aristotle maybe. So this one's about Van Gogh, and it just absolutely captivated me. I had never come across such a story of passion and abandonment to a call as I had encountered with Van Gogh. Also, it was 25 cents. It was like the best 25 cents I ever spent. At the same time, I was writing poetry because I felt so spiritually blighted. And I was sick of writing academic papers, and I couldn't find a form to tap into a different, part of the brain. So I was writing poetry, very bad poetry, and but I did love it. And I called the University of Memphis and said, hey, you know what? I want to take a graduate class in poetry. And I just called the right director of graduate studies. He said, well, you need a background in English to, get into an English master's degree. I said, well, I got a background in Bible. And he said, well, the Bible is literature. Go ahead and take the GRE and apply. So I was like, I don't know what the GRE is, but okay, I'll take it. And took it like the next week, got in, did my poetry class. And I was bitten by the bug. My love of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien was that flame was fanned a couple of years before. I had a senior level class in my undergraduate degree on Tolkien, and so that seed was planted there, and it just kind of started to water. That was it.
Cool. Yes, and of course, Lewis started off as a poet, so
that's right.
There's that other connection. Yeah, and we will circle back around to Tolkien in just a moment. So the book that we're talking about wasn't your first foray into the work of C.S. Lewis. You had written an earlier book titled When the Eternal Can Be Met, The Bergsonian Theology of Time, and the works of C.S. Lewis, T.S. Eliot, and W.H. Auden. How did that come about, and did that experience influence you writing the book about the art of writing?
Yeah, so that was my doctoral dissertation, actually. I I was interested in 20th century literature because of people like Lewis and Tolkien. And they introduced me to other writers who were, known for their literary acclaim, but also became Christians and had a kind of a legacy in the Christian literary community. So people like T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden, Graham Greene, Charles Williams, who was one of the Inklings. So I knew I wanted to focus on 20th century literature. I always imagined one foot in theology and one foot in literature. That sense almost, I don't have another foot to give there, but that sense sort of bled over into counseling actually, and psychology. But I was fascinated with philosophy, and particularly philosophies of time for no particular reason. I just have always been kind of, intrigued. So I'm studying Lewis, and to be honest, in most, state-run or kind of secular humanities programs or literature programs, Lewis is not respected he's not considered someone worthy to be studied. So I got a lot of resistance. So a project on Lewis alone, though I think more than worthy, wasn't going to cut it. So I found that in Lewis's Surprised by Joy, he mentions a guy named Henry Bergson, who was a French philosopher, and next to Einstein was maybe the greatest, public intellectual of the early 20th century, particularly when it came to time. Actually, he and Einstein sort of clash on their views of time. And Lewis had read him before he became a Christian. In some ways, Bergson had, kind of tilled the ground for Lewis spiritually and intellectually. And come to find out, Bergson had also been a huge influence to T.S. Eliot, who was author of The Wasteland, The Hollow Men, and things like that, and then became a Christian and wrote the 4 quartets. And another author that I was really fascinated by was W.H. Auden, who was a believer. And Auden knew Eliot, knew Lewis. He also converted to Christianity and wrote about time. So Lewis converts to Christianity, writes about time, and he writes about it in Mere Christianity. He writes about it in Screwtape Letters. The Great Divorce is almost entirely about time, it turns out. Eliot, the 4 quartets, is almost entirely about time. Auden was fascinated with time, wrote a poem called Kairos and Logos. And they all either knew directly or were directly influenced by, or at least kind of operated in the shadow of Henry Bergson. But no one had ever made that connection as fully as I thought it needed to be made. Turns out everything they said about time was thoroughly Bergsonian. I mean, it was Christian, but Bergson had this very spiritual view of time. So that was my my first, I guess, full-length treatment into something in Lewis. And I knew that Lewis, he was my central figure. He's the guy that influenced me most. My thinking is most patterned after Lewis's. And he's a guy that I wanted to be an expert in. So when it came time to write my second, kind of my sophomore book on Lewis, there's a million books on Lewis, and some not so great. And I didn't want to be that guy. So I wanted to wait for hopefully I'm not that guy. I don't know. I wanted to find something that had not been done. And I was the great Jerry Root, who is a huge influence, to me, and a kind of intellectual mentor. He's a professor up at Wheaton. He's written numerous books on Lewis, lectures on Lewis, and he's just a real gift to Lewis scholarship. He was presenting at a conference once, and the question was, what areas of Lewis had not been mined, really, and he just off the cuff said, Lewis and writing, like the craft of writing. And I thought, that cannot be the case. Surely someone has written about Lewis and writing. There have been, essay-length treatments of that, and sort of like little blog entries and things like that, but there was no manuscript-level treatment of Lewis and writing. So I thought, what? It really felt like a divine moment where God was kind of gifting me this topic. And, man, I was off to the races. That was it.
Cool. Well, you're doing a great service for us with all these moments in your life. Thank you. So was one reason for writing the book that, and I'm talking about The Art of Writing, that you identify with Lewis as a writer?
Yeah, Lewis was hard for me to read initially. I encountered him. I didn't read him until I was a senior in college. I guess I was 22. And Mere Christianity was the first text I read. And he was, in some ways, his real gift to writing and communication is his clarity. And at the same time, he's not easy. I mean, like for a country boy raised just north of Memphis, Tennessee, who never thought who barely got out of high school, I was not used to this very formal prose and most times in the form of long drawn out multi-comma syntax, So he was the first author that I really set out to understand. I would not just read him. I would read a sentence over and over and over. It got to the point where I read him more quickly or could understand him more readily than any other author I'd ever come across. I just read so much of him. Mm-hmm. So his writing, I'm most familiar with, and it's to read it sort of second nature to me. And I found, it makes sense. This is how we sort of learn to find our own voices. We typically imitate the voices of others. I found that in my essays or my book writing, my syntax took on that same kind of form, or at least I work through, lexicographically and in terms of my diction and structure, I work through thoughts the way he worked through thoughts. Mm-hmm. Not nearly so well, of course, but like that was the template. And then that's sort of the form in terms of like the content of his writing. I mean, come on, I'm like everybody else. I'm just a total fanboy. I mean, like no one has said what Lewis has said the way he said it. So I'm still starstruck by that,
So each chapter of your Art of Writing book includes something of C.S. Lewis's background and writings, followed by two specific sections. One is for the writer and the other is do try. Why'd you use that particular structure for the chapters?
Yeah, so this book, I had no idea what I was doing when I first set out on this book. I didn't know what form it was going to take, and it all came out of a letter, which I put in the introduction, that he wrote to a elementary school girl named Joan Lancaster in the 50s. She was tasked with writing a letter to her favorite author and asking him or her, what's some advice you have on writing? And he gives these 5 salient, which are excellent tips on how to be a clear and effective writer. And I knew I wanted the book to somehow take on that frame, these 5 points, but I just didn't have a full book in that. I couldn't make a full book out of just these 5 things. So I started to read his letters. I set out to read his letters. And if you know anything about Lewis's letters, they're 3 bound volumes, each over 1,000 pages. And I read them all. I was like, I want to know how he came to be the communicator that he was. So the more I got into his letters, the more I realized I cannot talk about him being a writer unless I talk about him being a reader. His craft was born out of his reading. So I dug into it and realized this is just going to be, it felt like it was going to be dry and dense. And the spirit of Lewis's letter, and not all that applicable, but the spirit of Lewis's letter was to be applicable. I mean, he was writing advice. So I thought this to me is a book about craft and maybe even like a how-to book. This should be a user-friendly book. So I wanted to sort of anchor each chapter in specific advice for creatives or specific advice for writers. But, writers are writers because they write. So I didn't want to just leave it with, hey, think about this. I wanted to put a prompt in there. Mm-hmm. That prompt, the phrase there, do try, comes out of, Lewis would get all these letters from kids well after the Narnia series, was complete. And they were curious if he was going to write more Narnia stories. And he would say, I think my Narnia days are done, but you should write a book. Maybe you should set out to write a Narnian story. And he would say, do try to these kids. So those were the prompt language came from.
Cool. I don't want to insult our listeners, but I do just want to make sure that they understand the time frame that we're talking about, and who exactly we're talking about. C.S. Lewis lived from 1898 to 1963, and he was a writer in one form or another, and you say this in your book, from when he was a child through his last year. He was the writer's writer, really, and he was an Oxford Don. He was a Cambridge professor, interestingly, in the area of medieval English literature, and he wrote the definitive text on that, but that's not what we remember him for, generally speaking. It's his popular literature, which, ranges from poetry to science fiction to theology to children's fantasies and, just anything that you can imagine. So, Corey, you make the point early on and throughout the book that the mark of a real writer is not the product of writing or even that one is able to write professionally, but instead whether writing gives meaning to life. Mm-hmm. So how do you see that playing out in Lewis's life?
Yeah. One of my favorite moments is, his best friend growing up, and one of his closest relationships through his adult life was his buddy Arthur Greaves, whom he met as a child. And, in The Four Loves, he talks about friendship kind of being this aha moment where you sort of say to another person, oh, you too? You had this kind of point of, commonality. And that was the case with he and Arthur when it came to like Norse mythology. Mm-hmm. Right. And they both had creative ambitions from an early age. Arthur, most people who know Lewis won't know Arthur Greaves, but he did try his hand at writing. And Lewis, before he became a Christian, was just dead set on being a prominent literary figure. He had a lot of ambition. Mm-hmm. The closer he got to that moment of conversion, first to being a theist, then a Christian, the greater his perspective on ambition and quote unquote success changed. And he had experienced some rejection before he became a Christian as a poet. And ultimately, as you said, right, he started in poetry. He doesn't really end in poetry, though he wrote it his whole life. It's not what he's known for. Well, Arthur had a moment where he was trying to get a book published, and it just got rejected. And Lewis writes this beautiful, in a series of letters, around 1930, he writes this beautiful, series of friendly epistles to Arthur and says, look, the mark of a writer isn't the finished product. It isn't the publication of the thing. It's the faithfulness to the process. And he said that beauty descends from God, and it's the job of the author to take it in, to be receptive to it, and then to, if we could borrow a term from Tolkien, to sub-create, right? To create from it. And in creating the book, the poem, the song, to give it back to God. And he says a perfect circle is made then. It's the process and faithfulness to the process. It's like Madeleine L'Engle says in her book, Walking on Water, we're to serve the work. And serving the work, you serve the one who gave you the work. Mm-hmm. Nowhere in that process or in that circle is there a promise to be published or be known for your publications or anything like that. So it really is the act of writing that makes you a writer. And Lewis, he often thought his books were going to be duds, often thought himself a failure, pretty self-deprecating many times with his works, and yet wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote because, to use his own language, to sort of put it back on him, because all these beautiful ideas, I think were being given by God to him, and he was faithful to making the circle. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lewis mentions the German word Sehnsucht, the literary term. It refers to a longing for something beyond this life. Can you tell us how that came about for Lewis? Who were the writers who most influenced Lewis in the early days?
Yeah, so one of his first, and for any listeners who want to get into this a little more deeply, read Surprised by Joy. That's where he really gets into it. Sehnsucht is almost synonymous with this idea of joy for Lewis. It first came from his brother Warnie via a little tin lid that Warnie had made a kind of a garden out of. He had sort of filled this little tin lid with grass and dirt and things like that. And he goes and shows it to a very, very young Lewis. And Lewis said that was one of those first kind of initiations into this idea of desire, that the toy garden revealed something to him that the real garden, at his house couldn't. And I think it was the idea of sort of something being made. This almost idea, and you sort of see this in some of his works too, that things have to become smaller before we can grasp the larger kind of reality behind them. And then there was that appetite whetted at that point. And then he came across people like Beatrix Potter, this worlds of talking animals and Norse mythology, where this vast sense of kind of cold openness was laid out before him. And then in his teenage years, particularly when he was under the tutelage of W.T. Kirkpatrick, he was introduced to all sorts of myth, and then his first taste of Shakespeare and texts that he would become an expert in. He was first introduced with books like George MacDonald's Fantastes, which he says baptized his imagination. So there's this long formative process that began in childhood that carried on to his teenage years. And each one of those texts, and I would say along with nature, each one of those texts increased his sense of Sehnsucht, which he finally would say, this desire, this yearning would find its ultimate, fulfillment and culmination in the person of Christ when he became a Christian. But yeah, these texts nurtured that yearning all the way until the point of being a Christian. And then it's not like it went away when he became a Christian. In one sense, that was when it really, really set in. But it was the foreshadowing of all these things, or the preamble to the faith that he associates with Sehnsucht.
Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.